So good morning, Glenn Branch, and good afternoon, Brazilian students. We are here today to listen our, it's with a great pleasure that we receive today Glenn Branch. He is from the National Center for Science Education of the United States and has a great experience with the war, as he is going to call, the war between the teaching of evolution and creationism. Glenn already have some idea that the situation in Brazil is quite similar in many ways to what they have in the United States in this context. Of course, in the United States, things are much worse, I should say. So the reason to have him, besides his knowledge and his experience that he has to share with us, the reason is mainly that we have to learn how to confront, how to keep defending the teaching of evolution in our schools and in the curriculum. So thank you very much, Glenn, for your kindness to be with us. And I will leave you on stage. Please, welcome.
Thank you very much. Let me just get the presentation up and running. Sorry, can you see a title?
Not yet.
Oh dear. Okay, sorry.
It's always like that.
How's that?
Yes, we are seeing the whole PowerPoint with your notes and the slides inside.
Hi.
But it's okay if you...
Well, sorry, I thought we got it worked out before, and
yeah, it's always like that. Don't worry.
I'll try that again.
Okay. And well, as the audience here already know, they can write the questions they would like to pose to Glenn. You can write questions in the chat, or you can stand your hand, and Marcelo will call you in order at the end of the presentation, okay?
Okay, so I'll get going. Hola, bom dia. And with that, I have totally exhausted my Portuguese, so I'm going to continue in English. Again, I'm Glenn Branch from the National Center for Science Education. That's a non-governmental organization in the United States, and I'm the Deputy Director of NCSC. And as you see, I'm going to be talking to you today about creationist attacks on evolution education in the United States, with a special emphasis, so far as I can manage it, on what Brazilians might want and need to know. So imagine that you had the use of a time machine and were interested in the teaching of evolution. If you traveled a century back in time to July 1921, what could you expect to encounter beside a nasty note from the physics department? Well, you wouldn't find any controversies, at least as regards the public schools, about the teaching of evolution, but you'd find that the conditions were ripe for it. First, in 1921, the Great War was still fresh in people's memory, thanks in part to a Stanford University biologist, Vernon Kellogg, who reported from the front that a German colleague told him that the war was a manifestation of the Darwinian struggle for existence. evolution was popularly associated in the American mind with German militarism and the horrors of the ensuing war. Also in 1921, a struggle for control of American Protestant denominations was escalating. Modernists were prevailing, so the fundamentalists had organized under that name, issuing a series of pamphlets, the Fundamentals, from 1910 to 1915, to articulate their position and stake out their claims.
Glenn, I'm
Yes.
sorry. I think your presentation is stopped. We are looking for the same first slide.
Oh, geez.
Sorry to interrupt you.
No.
Yeah.
I don't know how that happened because it's been zipping through for me.
Yeah. Yeah. So, okay, you can go on. Yes, the third one. Yeah.
Okay. No.
May you share full screen, please?
Não, ele não conseguiu, mas...
Oh, okay.
Sorry, let me just switch something.
Yeah.
Now you're seeing your other screen. It's all right.
Sorry, so what do you see on the other screen?
Oops, yeah, this is the other one.
Now you're seeing your presentation without the notes. That's okay for us.
Sorry, so ideally at this point you are seeing just a calendar.
Yes, that's perfect.
But it's, okay.
Yeah, that's it.
All right, so.
Okay,
all right, so World War I battlefield, Vernon Kellogg and his book. Wow, and now it's like totally out of sync on my side. Okay, so also in 1921, as I was saying, this struggle between modernists and fundamentalists over the control of American Protestant denominations. The Fundamentals is a series of pamphlets that comes out between 1910 and 1915 that articulates the fundamentalist position, stakes out their claims. Not all of this is thoroughly anti-evolution, but fundamentalism soon hardened into creationism. And in 1921, American public education was in the process of broadening after the war. Many students, particularly in rural areas, were for the first time being exposed to more than just reading, writing, and arithmetic, with books like George Hunter's Civic Biology, page from you see here, which included the concept of evolution being used in the classroom. And many parents didn't welcome this broadening of their children's horizons. The result, representing the first of three waves of anti-evolutionism the United States will be looking at, was a crusade to ban the teaching of evolution in America's public schools. The first proposed bill to do so in Kentucky failed to win passage in the state's legislature in 1922, thanks in part to the lobbying of scientists at the University of Kentucky. But in 1925, a similar bill, called the Butler Act, after its sponsor George Washington Butler, passed the Tennessee legislature and was signed by Governor Austin Peay. The Butler Act made it illegal to teach in a state-sponsored school, quote, any theory that denies the story of the divine creation of man as taught in the Bible, and to teach instead that man has descended from a lower order of animals. The American Civil Liberties Union, then just a baby organization, wanted to organize a legal challenge to the Butler Act and sought a teacher willing to be the defendant in a test case. This is from the Chattanooga Daily Times. And this publicity came to the attention of a group of businessmen in Dayton, Tennessee, who saw an opportunity to attract attention to their town. And they recruited John Thomas Scopes, a fresh college graduate hoping to pursue further studies. Scopes was working as a teacher in Dayton to save up money, teaching general science and coaching a little football. He didn't approve of the Butler Act. He had seen his professors in Kentucky fight against the 1922 bill there, so he agreed to be the defendant in what would be Tennessee versus Scopes. Scopes was at, as he titled his memoir, the center of the storm. Representing him at trial was the most famous defense lawyer of his day, Clarence Darrow, bottom left. Although Darrow was not the first or only member of the defense team, there was also the famously erratic and slovenly John Randolph Neal, the great orator Dudley Field Malone, who later went on to be a character actor in Hollywood, and Arthur Garfield Hayes of the ACLU. Likewise, although he wasn't the only member of the prosecution team, William Jennings Bryan got the headlines. A three-time Democratic presidential candidate and former Secretary of State under President Woodrow Wilson, Bryan became involved in the anti-evolution crusade on his retirement, lobbying to get anti-evolution legislation passed in states around the country. Bryan made headlines by serving on the prosecution team, but he made even more headlines when he agreed to Darrow's request, a highly unusual request, to testify at the Scopes trial as an expert on the Bible. The resulting examination was devastating, at least as far as the big city reporters were concerned. Bryan came across as both ignorant and complacent about that ignorance. But what mattered, of course, was the reaction of the jury. What would their verdict be? Well, the jury decided that Scopes had indeed violated the Butler Act. The judge imposed a fine of $100, and that was that. Well, in fact, that wasn't that. The defense team halfway expected to lose the trial all along and conducted its trial in the expectation of losing and then winning on an appeal. So, guilty. Meanwhile, the Dayton School Board offered Scopes another year's contract after the trial, which he declined. He went off to graduate school in geology at the University of Chicago. His replacement, by the way, missed the first week of classes in fall. And the substitute teacher, I swear I am not making this up, was a fellow named Darius Darwin. So the verdict in the Scopes case was appealed to the Tennessee Supreme Court, this happy-go-lucky crew, which overturned Scopes' conviction on a technicality. There was no ruling against the law itself. The court was clearly trying to avoid further embarrassment for the state, writing, "We see nothing to be gained by prolonging the life of this bizarre case." And the Butler Act remained on the books. Bryan died soon after the trial, and only two other states, Arkansas and Mississippi, enacted bans on teaching evolution. Yet, evolution went into educational abeyance. A study of textbooks that compared pre-Scopes trial and post-Scopes trial textbooks indicated that the controversy encouraged textbook publishers to downplay evolution thereafter. They started leaving it out of the index so you couldn't find it easily. And while it doesn't establish a causal connection between the controversy and classroom practice, a national survey of high school biology teachers conducted in 1939 and 1940 revealed that only about 54% were teaching evolution as a central principle of biology. And even some of these teachers were steering clear of human evolution, which was the main focus of Scopes era legislation like the Butler Act. And so only about 51% were teaching evolution without compromise. And again, bans on teaching evolution remained in place in Arkansas, Mississippi, and Tennessee. A hit Broadway play in 1955 and the film adaptation in 1960 brought the Butler Act back into the public eye. The playwrights, Lawrence and Lee, didn't intend to inherit the wind as a documentary. "We use the teaching of evolution as a parable," Lawrence told a newspaper in 1996, a metaphor for any kind of mind control. It's not about science versus religion, it's about the right to think. Yet the casting director did a pretty good job at getting the physical types of the stars matching the protagonists of the Scopes trial. And as the tagline, "It's all about the fabulous monkey trial that rocked America," indicates, the producers were happy enough to convey the impression that Inherent the Wind was a documentary about the Scopes trial, though it wasn't. Scopes, who had to leave graduate school during the Depression and spent his career working as a petroleum geologist, was recruited to publicize the movie of Inherit the Wind, and so attended its premiere in Dayton in 1960, his first visit to the town since 1931. Teachers still had to sign a pledge that they wouldn't teach evolution, he resignedly observed. And in fact, evolution didn't re-enter the American public schools in earnest until the 1960s, thanks to a polished metal sphere 23 inches in diameter. Sputnik, the first artificial satellite, launched by the Soviet Union in 1957. Fearing a loss in the space race, the US federal government poured funds into improving science, which included science education, which included biology, which included evolution. In Arkansas, one of those 3 states with Scopes-era bans on teaching evolution, a Little Rock teacher named Susan Epperson was told by her school to teach from a textbook that had been recently revised to include evolution. So she was being forced to violate the law. She sued the state, and the case wound its way to the Supreme Court, which in 1968 ruled that the ban violated the First Amendment to the US Constitution, which requires the government to be religiously neutral. Scopes was still around, I'm pleased to say, and he welcomed the decision striking down the bans on evolution, telling the Associated Press that as far as he was concerned, the decision came 43 years too late. The following year, he and Susan Epperson had lunch together in Shreveport, Louisiana, where he was retired. That's a picture of them there. Scopes died in the following year, 1970. By the time that the Supreme Court ruled in Epperson, though, Tennessee's Butler Act, under which Scopes had been prosecuted, was already a thing of the past. The Butler's Act's appeal was speedy, taking place between January and May 1967, and yet surprisingly Byzantine, involving 2 separate lawsuits and 2 separate bills in the state legislature. First, in 1967, a fellow named Martin Southern filed suit in the Knox County Chancery Court, charging that the Butler Act was unconstitutional. As his suit was pending, House Bill 48, which would have repealed the Butler Act, was introduced in the House of Representatives in Tennessee. A sign of the confidence of his sponsors was that they lightheartedly brought a live monkey to the House floor, wearing a sign reading, "Hello, Daddy-O." While it passed the House, the bill, not the monkey, the Senate reached a 16-16 deadlock on the bill, causing it to die. The bill, not the monkey. The monkey was fine. The Senate passed a bill of its own that did not repeal the Butler Act, but amended it. Only teaching evolution as a fact would be illegal. The Senate's intransigence helped focus attention on the second lawsuit in Tennessee. A week before the Senate's vote, the Campbell County Board of Education voted to fire a young teacher, Gary L. Scott, for teaching evolution. Scott sued the school board over his dismissal and also filed a federal class action lawsuit against the anti-evolution law. His legal team publicly offered to dismiss the latter lawsuit if the statute were repealed. Well, the Senate could take a hint. When it reconsidered House Bill 48 on May 16, 1967, less than 3 minutes of debate took place before a vote was taken. The Senate passed the bill on a 20-13 vote, and Governor Buford Ellington signed the bill into law 2 days later, thus helping to rehabilitate the state's reputation after 42 years of the Butler Act. This is a Scopes-era cartoon. So with evolution back in the textbooks and in the classrooms, and with legal barriers to its teaching falling under challenge or being repealed, the stage was set for the second wave of anti-evolution activity. It no longer being possible to ban the teaching of evolution in the public schools, The creationists instead attempted to balance the teaching of evolution. Balance it with what? Well, in the first instance, the Bible. This fellow is Russell Artist, born 1911, died in 2000, so that's a portrait of Artist as a young man. Artist was a biology professor at a religious college, Daniel Lipscomb in Nashville, Tennessee, a member of the Creation Research Society, a pseudo-scholarly group of creationists, and a co-author of the creationist textbook seen to the right there, published in 1970. The Tennessee State Textbook Commission would not adopt that text for use in the state's public schools. So thanks to Artist's urging, in 1973, a law was passed by the Tennessee legislature requiring that textbooks that discuss evolution represented as a theory, not a fact, and give an equal amount of attention to other theories, including, but not limited to, the Genesis account in the Bible. This law was challenged promptly in both state and federal courts. The federal case was Daniel v. Waters. Joe Daniel, seen here, was a zoology professor at the University of Tennessee, while Hugh Waters was the chair of the textbook commission. The court ruled that the law violated the constitutional guarantee of separation of church and state, in part because it gave a preferential position to the Bible, and in part because it explicitly provided, you'll love this, that occult or satanic theories were not protected, further indicating the law's religious motivations in effect. There's a well-known engraving by Gustave Doré. Some say it shows the fall from Satan from heaven as imagined in Paradise Lost, but I think it shows him being banished from Tennessee. So, creationists couldn't balance evolution with biblical creationism. In the second instance, then, creationists attempted to balance evolution with something called creation science, or sometimes scientific creationism. So what is creation science? In content, it's probably what you think of when you think about creationism, because it's now the dominant form of creationism in the United States and is at least highly visible overseas. Creation science claims that the universe and the earth are thousands, not billions of years old, that living things were specially created by God to reproduce after their own kind, so evolution across kinds is impossible, and that Noah's flood was a historic worldwide event responsible for a narrow genetic bottleneck, most of the fossil record, and major geological features like the Grand Canyon. This secularization of biblical creationism was influential. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, there were attempts in literally dozens of US states to require equal time in the classroom for creation science. 2 bills, one in Arkansas and one in Louisiana, were enacted, both in 1981. The Arkansas law was ruled unconstitutional in a landmark trial, McLean versus Arkansas, in 1982. One of the expert witnesses was Michael Roos, from who I believe you heard from before. Arkansas's law was vulnerable because it was very specific. I won't read all these provisions, but as you can see, it talked about creation ex nihilo, from nothing, evolution only within kinds, a worldwide flood, a young earth. But Louisiana's law defined creation science as consisting of the scientific evidences for creation and inferences from those scientific evidences, without ever saying what those were. Louisiana's law and Arkansas's law had a common ancestor in a model equal time bill, which itself was adapted from a model school board policy drafted by the Institute for Creation Research. But the day on which the references to the age of the earth and a global flood and all were stripped by the legislature from the bill, May 28, 1981, was the very day after McLean versus Arkansas, challenging the Arkansas bill, was filed in court. It seems clear that the proponents of creation science were worried that it would not, in all its details, survive constitutional scrutiny in a court. The Institute for Creation Research declined to participate in the Arkansas trial, but it hoped and worked for success in the Louisiana trial, even managing to get its own staff attorney appointed as a special state assistant attorney general for the case. Yet the comparative reticence of Louisiana's law didn't help it. When the challenge to it finally reaches the Supreme Court, the rulings in Edwards v. Aguillard, 1987, was, quote, "The act impermissibly endorses religion by advancing the religious belief that a supernatural being created humankind." The picture there shows the lead plaintiff, Donald Aguillard, there standing next to Susan Epperson. The decision in Edwards v. Aguillard notwithstanding, legislators still occasionally introduce legislation aimed at inserting creationism in the public school classroom. In 2021, just this year, Mary Bentley in Arkansas proposed to allow teachers to teach creationism as a theory of how the earth came to exist, which it isn't, but let's ignore that. This bill passed the lower house of the state legislature in Arkansas before being defeated on the narrowest of votes, 3-3, in the Senate Education Committee. Despite the decision in Edwards v. Aguillard, the idea still beckoned of further disinfecting creationism of its overtly religious content. So in the third instance of the strategy of balancing the teaching of evolution with something else, something called intelligent design was concocted and promoted by people like Michael Behe, a biochemist at Lehigh University, and books like Of Pandas and People. You can understand intelligent design's project best by understanding it as about finding something that can be billed as a scientific alternative to evolution that will survive constitutional scrutiny. So its proponents deny that their view entails any particular conception of the designer. It could be God, they say, but it could be aliens from outer space, or perhaps even time travelers from the far future. Similarly, the intelligent design movement strives to maintain a big tent under which all anti-evolutionists are welcome to shelter, including, in principle, young Earth creationists, old Earth creationists, ultra-Orthodox Jewish creationists, Islamic creationists, Hare Krishna creationists who take their cues from Hindu scriptures, Native American creationists, New Age creationists. The intelligent design movement intentionally takes no official position on the issues that divide anti-evolutionists. Maybe the Earth is 4.5 billion years old, as scientists say. Maybe it's 6,000 years old. Maybe, as with the Hare Krishna creationists, it's trillions of years old. Likewise for common descent, likewise for Noah's flood. Whatever you like, as long as you reject evolution, seems to be the motto. Well, almost. About the only anti-evolution group unwelcome to shelter under intelligent design's big tent is a clone-crazed, alien-worshipping, free-love UFO cult run by a former race car driver, the Raelians. Their public announcement of support for teaching intelligent design in U.S. public schools was met with a stony silence. But their exclusion from the big tent was presumably only tactical. So intelligent design is highly non-committal. Its central message is that somewhere, at some point in time, some intelligent agent somehow did something for some reason to affect the history of life, somehow. But given that most students in U.S. public school science classes will have notions about where, when, who, how, what, and why, the upshot of teaching intelligent design is clear: to promote religious belief. And make no mistake, despite the protestations and pretensions of its promoters to be interested in rigorous scientific endeavor, the primary target of intelligent design was the public schools. Of Pandas and People, shown here again, was the first book to use the phrase intelligent design in this specific sense, and it was intended and sold for use as a supplementary high school biology textbook. In its attempts to target public schools, however, intelligent design received a serious setback in 2005 in Dover, Pennsylvania. There, in 2004, the school board had been quarreling over biology textbooks, with one board member complaining that the standard textbook was laced with Darwinism and seeking to have Of Pandas and People adopted. In the resultant fracas, the board formulated and voted to adopt a policy requiring that, quote, students will be made aware of gaps/problems in Darwin's theory and of other theories of evolution, including, but not limited to, intelligent design. This was the first school district policy in the country requiring the teaching of intelligent design. This policy was implemented as a requirement that a 4-paragraph disclaimer about evolution be read aloud. The teachers refused to read that disclaimer, and administrators had to do it. Among other things, the disclaimer commended of pandas and people to the students' attention. Fortunately, there were enough copies to go around, since as yet anonymous citizens had kindly donated no fewer than 50 copies to the school. 11 local parents filed suit, and this case is Kitzmiller versus Dover. The plaintiff's legal team decided to have Tammy Kitzmiller as the plaintiff, partly because she had a child in the 9th grade biology class, so she could claim to be in imminent danger of being harmed by the policy and the disclaimer, and in part because they really liked her name. They felt it was a good, solid, euphonious Pennsylvania Dutch surname, Kitzmiller. Representing the board in this lawsuit was the religious right organization, the Thomas More Law Center. Initially, the Discovery Institute, the de facto institutional headquarters of intelligent design, was going to participate, but they squabbled with the Thomas More folks. Various luminaries of the intelligent design movement were slated to testify, although 2 of the 3 most important pulled out after the squabble. Representing the 11 parents were the ACLU, that's American Civil Liberties Union, of Pennsylvania, Americans United for Separation of Church and State, and a private law firm, Pepper Hamilton. The National Center for Science Education, where I worked, consulted throughout, devoting untold hours to the case, and the expert witnesses, which we recruited, included 3 members of our board of directors. After a trial spanning a biblical 40 days, with extensive expert testimony, the Kitzmiller decision came. The judge, a Republican, churchgoer, and George W. Bush appointee, found that the school district's policy violated the U.S. Constitution because intelligent design represents, at bottom, a religious belief. His decision was issued on December 20th, 2005, so we describe it as a Merry Kitzmas for the plaintiffs. That wasn't the end of intelligent design, to be sure. True, legislators in Indiana and Utah, who had promised to introduce intelligent design legislation, abandoned those efforts after the Kitzmiller decision. Yet as late as 2013, for example, there was a bill in Missouri that would have required equal time for intelligent design in the state's public schools. But despite this trend toward finding more and more secular-seeming forms of creationism, biblical creationism, creation science, intelligent design, with which to balance the teaching of evolution, intelligent design has got to be the end of the line as far as that strategy is concerned, as the cartoonist Tom Tolles observes. You just can't get vaguer and more non-committal. That's why we're now entering, and have been for the last 19 years, as I would date it, a 3rd wave of anti-evolutionism in the United States. Now, it no longer being possible to establish formal policies banning or balancing the teaching of evolution, creationists have to try to establish formal policies belittling evolution. Obviously, it has to begin with B. So catchphrases associated with this 3rd wave include theory not fact, teach the controversy, academic freedom, evidence for and against, strengths and weaknesses, and critical analysis, and so on. All of these appeal to secular considerations and Enlightenment values, but are used in the service of a noticeably darker agenda. To be clear, I'm not claiming that these are new catchphrases or that this is a new strategy. What's new is using such phrases in the absence of references to supposed alternatives to evolution. Creationists have always had such phrases in their arsenal of arguments aimed at undermining the teaching of evolution. What's new is now they have nothing else, or at least nothing as reliable. Let me take a moment to point to, forgive the expression, the strengths and weaknesses of this third strategy. Creationists could once more or less overtly appeal to religious considerations in arguing for banning or balancing the teaching of evolution, even engaging in hellfire preaching like Billy Sunday, the famous chair-smashing baseball player turned evangelist of the Scopes era, himself a creationist. But they can't do so now. Confining themselves to what the New York Times editorially dubbed the crafty attacks on evolution, creationists can come across as offering reasonable sounding secular arguments, that's a strength, but they thereby find it harder to rally their base, which responds better to hellfire preaching than to academic jargon, and that's a weakness. Within this third phase of anti-evolution activity, in which, again, the emphasis is on belittling evolution, there have been, in turn, two approaches. The first was to require teachers to belittle evolution. For example, Florida Senate Bill 1854 from 2011, which wanted schools to provide a thorough presentation and critical analysis of the scientific theory of evolution. That might sound good until you realize that critical analysis is code for criticism. There's really no question here because the sponsor of the bill had previously announced his intention to introduce a bill that would require the teaching of intelligent design, saying, if you're going to teach evolution, then you have to teach the other side so you can have critical thinking. Fortunately, this bill died. Now, a problem with bills requiring teachers to belittle evolution, although not the crucial problem, is that they require something to be taught, inviting hard questions, perhaps not as many as 20, about what that is, where it's to be found, who's going to pay for it. They also raise the hackles of teachers who understandably don't want to be micromanaged by state legislatures. So more popular have been a string of bills taking the second approach within the belittling strategies. These do not require, but instead permit something to be taught, often under the rubric of academic freedom. In fact, there have been about 80 academic freedom bills introduced since 2004, with 3 unfortunately being enacted. Both amusing and ironic is the fact that a former colleague of mine at NCSE, Nick Motzke, who worked on the Kitzmiller trial, managed to get a publication in the journal Science, by applying state-of-the-art phylogenetic methods, that is to say, evolutionary methods, to the text of these anti-evolution bills to reveal their genealogical relationships. I call this Motzke's Kitzmas tree. The 3 academic freedom bills that were passed were in Mississippi in 2006, Louisiana in 2008, and Tennessee in 2012. Let's take a look at the most recent, which was enacted despite a massive protest from Tennessee's scientific and educational communities. Governor Bill Haslam allowed the bill to become law, albeit without his signature. You don't have to read it all, but this is the key provision of the statute. What this says is that when it comes to the scientific strengths and scientific weaknesses of the theories covered in the state science standards, teachers are basically free to do anything they want to help students, quote, understand, analyze, critique, and review in an objective manner those strengths and weaknesses, free from any oversight. Since none of those terms are defined in the bill, in the law, and there's no way to adjudicate among competing definitions of them looking at the law in effect encourages science teachers with idiosyncratic opinions to teach anything they please, so long as they can claim that in doing so, they're helping students to appreciate the scientific strengths and scientific weaknesses of a theory covered in the state science standards. Earlier versions of the bill specifically cited biological evolution, as well as the chemical origins of life, global warming, and human cloning. And it seems clear that legislative support was based on the perception that the law would empower and embolden Tennessee's science teachers to present creationism, in one form or another, in their science classrooms. As a consequence, it was nicknamed the Monkey Bill. My pal, the magnificently bearded Michael Kohut, who wrote his doctoral dissertation on evolution in Tennessee circa 2009 to 2012 at Vanderbilt, which is a good university in Nashville, Tennessee, told a local newspaper when the law was passed that lots of Tennessee teachers were already teaching creationism, and that it was likely that teachers there would understand the law as allowing and encouraging them to do so. A rigorous national survey of public high school biology teachers conducted in 2007 revealed that about 16%, 1 in 6, were themselves creationists, agreeing that God created human beings in their present form at one time within the last 10,000 years or so. And about 13%, 1 in 8, were presenting creationism as scientifically credible in their classrooms. But there's more. The law passed in Tennessee is also profoundly anti-democratic. As matters stand, in the United States, public education is ultimately under democratic control in the following sense. The people vote for representatives at the local, state, and federal level, who then set policy that is enacted by administrators, who all wear hats and carry briefcases, and they do so through managing classroom teachers. This is so basic a point in US civics that you can represent it all in clip art, as you see. But the academic freedom anti-evolution bills, by prohibiting administrators from reining in rogue teachers, would make public school teachers unaccountable to the public. And again, 1 in 8 high school biology teachers was already teaching creationism as scientifically credible. How much worse would the situation be if these bills were widely enacted? That brings you up to date on the 96 years of anti-evolution legislation since the Scopes trial, but it doesn't quite account for all the anti-evolution activity. Since the 1980s, there have been battles over the place of evolution in standards, not Roman standards, but state science education standards, and these have been intensifying as standards have become more important. What are state science standards? Well, they're the ultimate source of guidance for science teachers because they specify what students in the state's public schools are expected to learn. Standards thus influence the content of textbooks, statewide testing, and coursework for pre-service and in-service teachers. Importantly, they also provide a shield for teachers facing misguided community pressure. They can say, it's not my decision that evolution is taught, it's the state's decision. Go complain to the state. Standards have provided creationists with a pulpit in public education, though. For example, in 1995, the Alabama State Board of Education inserted a provision in the state science standards that required evolution not to be presented dogmatically, and then used that to require a disclaimer to be attached to all biology textbooks used in Alabama, which presumably were too dogmatic. The board recently voted for a weaker version of that disclaimer to remain. So standards are increasingly important, and as a result, battles over the place of evolution in state science standards have been frequent. In the last 10 years, we've had fights in Arizona, Florida, Iowa, Kansas, New Mexico, Oklahoma, South Carolina, and Texas. And I might have forgotten a few. Creationists have been on the losing side of these battles, generally, but not entirely. Even where there haven't been such battles, there's no reason for complacency. In 2009, 2 of my colleagues assessed the treatment of evolution in state science standards. The states marked with the darker colors have worse treatments of evolution. There have been some changes in the last 12 years, though. Most of them, I'm pleased to say, for the better. The biggest development in state science standards in the last 10 years was the release of the next generation science standards in 2013. These are a model set of standards developed by a consortium of nonprofit organizations in 26 states. The next generation science standards highlight biological evolution, unity, and diversity as a disciplinary core idea of the life sciences in the middle and high school levels. By now, 20 states, plus the District of Columbia, have adopted the NGSS, and a further 24 states have adopted standards based on the same evolution-friendly framework on which the NGSS are based. Owing to the radical decentralization of American education, though, every school district is a potential battleground, and there are about 13,500 local school districts. This shows you their boundaries in the lower 48 states. Each district has a degree of autonomy over curriculum and instruction, so there are always opportunities for creationists to try to make headway in undermining the teaching of evolution, which is one reason creationism is able to persist. There's always hope. This decentralization of American education makes it hard to know for sure how extensively and how well evolution is being taught. In many biology classes, evolution takes a back seat, as the New York Times reminds us. Origins of species, in many schools, the dog ate that chapter. Anecdotes and impressions are rife, but fortunately there's data too. In 2019, one of the researchers from the Berkman et al. Paper and staff from NCSE conducted a partial replication of that 2007 survey, and we published a report on it about a year ago in June 2020 in the journal Evolution, Education, and Outreach. There are the proud parents there, Eric Plutzer, me, and my colleague Ann Reed. And among the headline results was that about 2 in 3, 67% of high school biology teachers are presenting evolution forthrightly, emphasizing the broad scientific consensus on evolution while not giving any credence to creationism. Well, that's a statistic, but should we be pleased by the 67% or appalled by the 33%? In that earlier survey from 2007, we found that 13% of high school biology teachers was presenting creationism as scientifically credible. Only a few were skipping evolution altogether, but 1 in 6 were skipping human evolution. And just as disturbing, 6 in 10 were teaching evolution half-heartedly, less than forthrightly. Those results turned out to be somewhat misleading. In preparing the 2019 paper, 2020 paper, excuse me, Plutzer and I went back to the 2007 data and realized that the categories used there were not defined to be mutually exclusive. So we adopted a new typology according to whether teachers reported emphasizing the broad scientific consensus on evolution and whether they reported emphasizing creationism as a valid scientific alternative to evolution. One sec, I think I need a drink. As you see, the result is 4 categories, which are mutually exclusive and exhaustive. Evolution as settled science, which is what we want, mixed messages, avoidance, and advocacy of creationism. The old data from the 2007 survey, analyzed in the new typology, then looks like this. You might think that this makes things look better. After all, now we have a majority of teachers, 51%, presenting evolution as settled science. But remember that Riddle survey in 1939-1940 found that only 51% of teachers were presenting evolution as a central principle of biology. Does that mean there was no progress at all in 67 years? Well, probably not. The Riddle survey had a sampling bias and a response bias that makes it likely that teachers who presented evolution as a central principle of biology were overrepresented. And the questions used in the Riddle survey and the Berkman survey aren't exactly comparable in any case. And moreover, these questions only measure a small part of what makes for good or bad evolution education. But still, it's not good that the numbers aren't shifting at all, 51%, 51%. When we compare the 2007 and the 2019 surveys, though, there definitely was progress. From 51% of high school biology teachers reporting emphasizing evolution and not creationism in 2007 to 67% in 2019. And that progress is matched by drops in the teachers endorsing both evolution and creationism, avoiding endorsing either, and endorsing creationism without endorsing evolution. What accounts for the difference? Since NCSE, where I work, was intimately involved in the Kitzmiller case, having put together the legal team and recruiting the expert witnesses and supporting the legal team, it would be nice to think that sweeping legal victory played a role. Alas, the evidence does not point that way. In 2003, excuse me, Randy Moore administered a questionnaire about the legal issues over teaching evolution and creationism in the public schools to a convenient sample of Minnesota high school biology teachers taking the questions and answers from the federal case law. And Moore found that a large majority of teachers was already aware that it's unconstitutional to teach creationism in the public schools. So the Kitzmiller case probably didn't make a difference. A variety of explanations are possible, but we found that teachers in NGSS states reported having taken more pre-service and in-service coursework in evolution than their colleagues elsewhere. These are pre-service teachers at Cornell University in New York State. So this suggests that the increased expectations of improved state science standards impelled both novice and veteran teachers to upgrade their content knowledge of evolution. Excuse me. So I resume. Prediction is uncertain, especially about the future, but let me offer a three-part forecast. First, we're not going to see any significant anti-evolution legislation pass, whether in the form of academic freedom bills or in attacks on standards. For the former, the low-hanging fruit has already been plucked. For the latter, legislatures are usually, though not always, unwilling to micromanage education to such a degree. Nevertheless, and second, it's going to be a long time before the evolution wars in the US are over. That just follows from the decentralized nature of American education, with 13,500 odd local school districts having primary responsibility for curriculum and instruction. Changes to science education are inevitably going to be slow, scattered, and incremental. Third and finally, the signs for the long term are promising. Look at this graph of American public opinion on evolution over the last 35 years. The gray shading around each line indicates the 99% confidence interval. So the point at which the gray shading on the blue and the gray shading on the red stop intersecting is about 2012. That is to say, 2012 is the first year in which we can be really confident that acceptance of evolution is more common among the American public than rejection. And this is an achievement I hope and expect not to see reversed. So it's worth observing that the US is a global outlier. There certainly are creationists and occasionally controversies over evolution education abroad, sometimes exported from the United States. But it was only a bit of an overstatement for Stephen Jay Gould, the paleontologist, to claim this controversy is as locally and distinctively American as apple pie and Uncle Sam. It was hardly surprising then that in a 2005 comparison of opinion on evolution in 34 developed countries, co-authored by one of my colleagues, the United States placed next to last for its acceptance of evolution. We were beaten out by such scientific powerhouses as Latvia and Cyprus, but we did manage to edge out a win over Turkey. More recent data paints more or less the same picture. You'll note that this chart includes Brazil, with 54% of evolution among the general population, lagging the US at 64%. And as in the US, sometimes rejection of evolution leads to attacks on evolution education. Yep. In 2014, Marco Feliciano, a controversial federal deputy and Assembly of God pastor, introduced a bill calling for the inclusion of creationism in the curriculum, ostensibly to balance, where we've seen that word before, the presentation of evolution. An almost identical bill had been proposed in the Parana state legislature in 2007. And as you will all know better than I, the Bolsonaro presidency is cozy with creationists. For example, naming Benedito Aguiar Neto, a proponent of intelligent design at Mackenzie Presbyterian University, to run the agency that oversees Brazil's graduate study programs last year. As if echoing Feliciano, he said that intelligent design should be introduced to balance the teaching of evolution. Returning to the US, let's think about this disconnect between scientists and the public a little further. When the Pew Research Center found in 2015 that 98% of American scientists accepted evolution, nobody was particularly surprised. And the same poll found that only 65% of the American general public was okay with evolution, with 31% preferring humans have existed in their present form since the beginning of time instead. So why is there this disconnect? Apparently, a mixture of ignorance and ideology is at work. In a 2012 US survey, for example, common ancestry of humans and other animals was accepted by only 48% of respondents. But the claim that the theory of evolution says that humans have common ancestors with other animals was accepted by 72% of respondents. So this enables us to tease out some general reasons. When we look at the crosstabs, it turns out that slightly more than half of the evolution deniers lacked even a minimal understanding of evolution, insofar as they didn't agree that the theory of evolution says that humans are descended from earlier species. Slightly less than half of the evolution deniers reject evolution while displaying at least that minimal understanding of what it in fact involves, presumably because of ideological commitments that prevent them from accepting it. What are those ideological commitments exactly? Clearly, they're religious in nature, but we can be more exact than that. Creationism is largely driven by inerrantism about the Bible, the view that the Bible is without error in all it teaches, including not only matters of faith and morals, but also matters of history and science. About a quarter of Americans report taking an inerrantist view. Now, inerrantists can, and do, disagree about what the Bible in fact teaches, but enough of them are convinced that it teaches that God created different kinds of living things separately and miraculously, that creationism manages to be an ongoing social and political phenomenon in the United States. Next slide, there we go. Inerrancy in turn has roots. I attribute it to a combination of Protestantism's emphasis on sola scriptura, the view that the Bible is the sole infallible source of authority for Christian faith and practice, and the fact that the United States, unlike the Protestant nations of Europe, doesn't have a state church, which would have tended to make doctrine more uniform and more informed and responsive to scholarship. Removed from ecclesiastical hierarchies by both distance and predilection, American religion is, and always very much has been, a do-it-yourself affair. In the absence of any other source of religious authority, Americans have turned to personal religious experience, as with Pentecostalists and Quakers and Shakers, or to the Bible, as with inerrantists, for that religious authority. Yep, wrong one. Inerrancy was in place in the US well before the publication of On the Origin of Species in 1859. Once evolution appeared, an inerrantist backlash was not long in appearing, creationism. That might suggest that creation is exclusively an American phenomenon. Not so, for three reasons. First, although the US is certainly an outlier, other countries and regions harbor, if to a lesser degree, the sorts of religious commitments that lead to inerrancy and thus to creationism. This is particularly true of English-speaking Protestant countries, Canada, the United Kingdom, especially Northern Ireland, Australia and New Zealand, and South Africa. But we also see inerrantism in, for example, certain branches of Islam. Second, there's a long-standing tradition in American creationism of regarding evolution as part and parcel, or even the source, of a package of real and imagined social evils. This image showing an axe-wielding creationist trying to chop down a tree with evolution as its trunk, and humanism, racism, the radical feminist movement, pornography, Nazism, etc. as its branches is representative. The creation science message, as it's dubbed here, is not just opposed to evolution, but to modernity, or a particular conception of modernity. So both in the US and around the world, creationism often plays an important part in anti-modernist movements, whether it's regarded as central, as in that last slide, or not. and anti-modernist themes, in turn, are often reflected in creationism. And third, because the origin claims of racist and ethno-nationalist movements often conflict with the evolutionary sciences, particularly archaeology and paleoanthropology, such movements often adopt a subset of creationist arguments and tropes, as with some racist supremacist movements in the US and the ruling BJP party in India. What is to be done? The two sources of the disconnect between scientific knowledge and public opinion with regard to evolution suggests that there are two basic approaches to improving the state of evolution education. First, increasing the amount of training in evolution and pedagogical methods for teaching evolution effectively that pre-service biology teachers get in their education and in-service biology teachers get in their professional education. And we've seen already how improvements in state science standards can drive such increases. The second approach to improving the state of evolution education involves being aware of the ideologies that stand in the way, sometimes carrying signs. Notice the pun here, evolution instead of evolution. Of course, it's neither possible nor desirable to try to directly change the ideologies of teachers, parents, and members of the community who harbor ideological reservations about evolution. But it is possible to make evolution less threatening to such people. For example, by showing them that there are people who share their values, yet accept the science, such as Francis Collins, the director of the US National Institutes of Health and an evangelical Christian who accepts evolution, or Kenneth R. Miller, a cell biologist, the co-author of a popular series of high school biology textbooks in the US, and a Catholic. You might be wondering where NCSE fits into all of this. Operating from its small office in California, NCSE has served for almost 40 years as a crisis clinic for those facing challenges to evolution education in their communities. That, of course, is the office. Since climate change education is now under similar attack, we added it to our portfolio a few years ago. Of course, we would like for there to be no need for our services, but there are no signs of that happy day on the horizon. Tactically, it's important to fight back against the encroachments of creationists, rebuffing teachers who try to preach creationism and battling in state houses and courthouses against laws and policies that would undermine the integrity of science education. The National Center for Science Education coordinates activity like this across the country, although this is a Scopes era cartoon. Complementing those efforts, we've also been conducting research like the survey I described earlier, aimed at informing efforts, those of NCC and of others, to promote and defend science education in socially but not scientifically controversial areas, such as evolution and climate change. And NCSE has an ongoing project called NCSE Teach, which is aimed at helping teachers feel confident and prepared in teaching such socially controversial topics like evolution and climate change. A new project that we're excited about involves recruiting master teachers to collaboratively develop innovative lesson plans on these topics and then serve as ambassadors back home to their colleagues. As you will have gathered, there are a lot of moving parts involved with NCSE's work to defend the teaching of evolution against ideological attack, which is one reason that I enjoy my job. There's always something different coming down the pike. But a particularly fun part of it is having the chance to discuss it with interested folks like you. So I thank you for your attention today.
So, thank you. Very nice. Yeah. If you want to open your mic, just to make Glenn heard our applause. Yeah.
Thank you.
Great talk, Glenn. I will leave Marcelo to make the questions, so to arrange the questions from students. But I'm without words to talk about. It's the same feeling I had the first time I read one of your texts, one of your articles. The feeling is that we have so much to do about it. yet, and we have a lot of things to learn with you and the experience you have in the United States. And okay, at least our pandemic is almost going away, so we can turn for the everyday questions again. And this will be a big challenge for us too, as you show it in your slides with the people from Brazil. We are just in the beginning of this great war, but we have to act quickly to not have it grow enough. Well, thank you.
Thank you for those kind words.
Yes, please, Marcelo.
Okay, Professor Glench, thank you so much for your presentation, very insightful. I have some questions here in the chat from Flavio Ferreira, is our colleague who doesn't have a microphone available. So I will read his question. And he says, good morning and thanks for the class, Professor Branch. In the US, is there the idea of people seeing any professional with a degree as the authority to argue about any issue, including biological evolution, just as in Brazil?
So I guess I'm not sure I understand the question. So certainly people will appeal to authority and to expertise in supporting whatever position they want to take on the teaching of evolution. Sometimes, of course, that's perfectly appropriate, as when people appeal to the views of professional organizations such as the National Association of Biology Teachers or scientific organizations such as the National Academy of Science. We do see spurious appeals to authority as well. The long-term creationist fighters have a joke about something called the Salem hypothesis, which says that doctors and engineers are disproportionately represented among creationists. And that's sort of an empirical generalization that no one has actually tried to investigate, but there's certainly a strong feeling that it's true. And one of the suggested explanations is because doctors and engineers are respected professionals who have something to do with science, so they make effective spokespeople for creationism as that result, even though their credentials and training and expertise is not particularly relevant. So I'm not sure if that answered the question, but I thought it was a good answer.
Okay, thank you. And proceeding to the list, I think the next one is Pedro Navarro. Pedro, welcome and please do your question.
Hey Glenn, thanks for your talk. You kind of answered my question, but I would like you to elaborate more. You showed a map that in the bottom states, Texas and some others, there were more of a problem. And I guess I'm looking for a sense of consequence to try to not be so frustrated, but in these states or in the counties where people have worse evolution teaching, do they proceed to have well-paid jobs? They go to better universities, or is there a consequence? Can you see this consequence? If you had a better, worse biology time during high school, you don't get to be in the best university. It seems like, by what you said, that doctors and engineers, well, it seems not to hold true. But well, if you care to elaborate about that.
Certainly.
Thank you.
Yeah, excellent question, and one that has practical consequences, because it would be very convenient when we're engaged in struggles over the teaching of evolution to be able to say, look, if you do this, your community is going to have economic harms. So I'd like to be able to say that, but the data is really too sparse. First, the kind of connections between what the quality of high school biology education and the economy of a city, a county, a state, are very hard to tease out. And there are so many confounding factors that I don't think anyone's even tried. I've talked to some economists who were interested, and they eventually gave up and said, even if there's a signal here, we probably wouldn't be able to detect it with all the noise. We do, allied to this though, sometimes some businesses have been willing to go out on a limb and say, for example, well, especially high-tech businesses, if you pass this misguided action that would undermine the teaching of evolution, we're a lot less likely to expand our facility here or to move our facility here. And sometimes that has, does have an effect, and people pay attention to that. In one state, a Midwestern state, much to my surprise, the State Chamber of Commerce came out against one of the academic freedom bills. And it's normally just all they're about is promoting business interests. So it's very surprising to see them taking a principled stand for science education, and very welcome too, I might add. But very hard to find anything data-driven about this.
Thank you.
Okay, and the next one is João Gabriel. João, welcome, and please do your question.
Good afternoon here already in Brazil, I guess that in the US too. Thank you for this incredible lecture, Professor Mr. Branch. Context-wise, I'd like to start by stating that lately in Brazil, we have been experiencing a terrifying surge in scientific negationism and political polarization too, in a similar fashion as what has been going on in the US. And I was wondering if how both sides, what exactly both sides in the political battleground in the US have been saying about evolution. How is evolution, what is the point of view that each of the two poles of political fight, what their perspective on evolution is? I don't know if I'm being clear enough about my question.
No, I think that's clear. So yes, evolution is one of the issues that has been, it used to be more religiously polarized, but and now the religion poles are kind of moving together with the political poles. So in general, there's a pretty good correlation between being a Republican and, if not necessarily being a full-out creationist, at least being creationist friendly or creationist adjacent, and between being a Democrat and accepting evolution. It's not the most polarized issue. William Jennings Bryan was a Democrat back in the 20s. The sponsor of the Louisiana bill that was passed in 2012 was a Democrat. A conservative Democrat, to be sure. So we do see that polarization with evolution. It doesn't play a huge role in the actual day-to-day politics for most political offices. Most political offices don't have anything to do with curriculum and instruction in the public schools. We will see it sometimes with state boards of education in states where those are elected rather than appointed position. And Texas, for example, has a very polarized state board of education, usually with a conservative Republican majority, which is one reason that evolution education has suffered so much in Texas over the last, 50 years, really.
Thank you. I asked this question because I was trying to compare the situation with Brazil. I think that here we can see evidently also that correlation between being a governist and being creationist. But well, I don't really know the real proportions of this, but in my personal experience, I have been noticing that even between leftist movements and anti-governance movements, we have been seeing some sort of surge also in anti-evolutionism. I wouldn't say creationism, but anti-evolutionism. And I was wondering if that also happened in the US. And thank you so much for your response.
Yeah, no, that's a very interesting question. So I don't think we see a lot of we don't see a lot of creationism on the left in the US, although we do see some. We do see some kind of anti-evolutionism, which is not driven so much by religious sentiment as by association of evolution with racism, sexism, imperialism, kind of inevitably, because evolution gets developed as a scientific discipline, mainly in Europe, mainly in the 19th century, at a time when racism, sexism, and imperialism are all very much going concerns. So we do see some misguided resistance on the left to evolution for that kind of reason, I think.
Okay, the next one is Professor Maria Elice. Please welcome.
Thank you, Marcelo. I would just, I like to take back the question of the teacher training, biology teachers, because yeah, we know in high school, and it's a completely different thing, but I'm thinking about this quantity of biology teachers that stand against, that doesn't, that do not believe in evolution, or at least they prefer to believe in creationism, even if they are able to teach some evolution. I don't know. My question is, what universities should have been doing with this, and or what is what they are doing to change a little this, and if you, I would like to know if you have data comparing these biology teachers that comes from no religions universities, and the ones compared with the biology teachers that comes from university that are linked with this creationist credo.
So as the last part of the question, do I have data on comparing teachers who were educated at religious and non-religious universities? Maybe. So I have some data that probably has it buried somewhere, but I haven't done the analysis. There are a lot of religious universities in the United States where evolution is taught matter-of-factly and without reservations. There are also more colleges where creationism is taught. These are usually small, not very well funded, not very well respected institutions, and so we'd have to kind of sort between regular religiously affiliated universities and Bible colleges. And I kind of suspect that the data is just not, the data set's not big enough to get statistically reliable information. I should say I've been talking mainly about public schools in the United States. Roughly about 10% of US school-age students are in private schools. Many private schools are religiously affiliated. Many of the religiously affiliated ones are run by evangelical or fundamental Christians, and they probably teach creationism only or creationism along with evolution. Don't have any data on those schools. We didn't go after them. So the landscape of teacher development in the United States is also very decentralized. There are certainly hundreds and possibly thousands of places where you can be trained to become a biology high school teacher, and there has not been a tremendous amount of systematic investigation. There have been developments at the federal level that increasingly require teachers to have an undergraduate degree in the discipline they're teaching, and that has probably helped.
Okay, thank you.
So the next one in the line is Julia Nader. Julia, welcome and do your question, please.
Hello, good afternoon. Again, great lecture, thank you. My question is more curiosity, I guess. I was wondering if the creationism have a religious background, if this religious background is affecting other disciplines or subjects, and if this influence may be by the interdisciplinarity are contributing for this creationism politics or the tradition of them, and if you know something about it. Thank you.
Thanks. So particularly young Earth creationism, which involves more than just a denial of evolution, but also denial of, for example, the scientifically ascertained ages of the Earth and of the universe. So young Earth creationists perforce have to deny not only evolutionary biology, but also large chunks of geology and physics. Because if you can't get, because they have to somehow explain radiometric dating away, they have to explain the fact that there are, stars in the sky that are more than 6,000 light years away. So if young Earth creationists have the unenviable task of having to develop a whole alternative to modern science consistent with their core beliefs. So there's a lot of detailed work they put into it, none of it at all convincing, but it certainly goes well beyond the discipline of evolutionary biology. Other creationists, called old Earth creationists, generally don't have such a problem with other disciplines. Sometimes young Earth creationists also have to go after history and archaeology because, for example, the Egyptians were building pyramids at the time that the Noah's flood was supposed to have inundated the entire globe, which is inconvenient. So they will have to go after those disciplines as well. Most of the legislative and policy initiatives of creationism, though, are kind of aimed at biological evolution.
Thank you.
Okay, the next one is Professor Igor Cesarino.
Thank you, Marcelo. Thank you, Glenn, for the great talk. I was wondering, we all know that the concept of freedom and liberty is something very important for the American people. I remember that several years ago, I watched an American movie called Thank You for Smoking. And I don't know if you're familiar with that movie, but it's the story of a lawyer that defends the smoking industry. It's about the lobby for the smoking industry. And there's a particular moment of the movie which is very interesting, that his young son, he asks, why do you protect this industry? Why do you defend people to smoke? And he says, I don't defend people to smoke. I defend the right for them to smoke, the freedom that they can choose to smoke. So I think that's idea that it's very important for the American people. So do you think that somehow this idea has helped negationism or anti-evolutionism movement? Because people might think I have the right to choose whether I want to choose learning in a more creationism perspective or evolutionary perspective. Somehow this idea of freedom would benefit this movement.
Yeah, so it's certainly true that the appealing to ideals of freedom are, a standby of any kind of American social political movement. And it appears a lot in the creation evolution controversy. The creationists don't necessarily appeal to freedom consistently. So bear in mind, this is a movement that's the first phase of which involved banning the teaching of evolution. And one of the arguments used by the defense in the Scopes case was that Scopes should have the freedom to teach biology as he saw fit, to which the creationist answer was, look, the state of Tennessee is paying him. The state of Tennessee gets to tell him within broad parameters what to do and what not to do. And that part of the state's argument was actually correct. The state does have a right to prescribe curriculum, and the state and states do continue to prescribe curriculum. Now, of course, the idea with the third wave of creation strategies is the idea is, look, we have to give these teachers freedom to teach biology as they see fit. And the answer is, well, several answers is that's not a good idea in general, and also it violates a higher law, namely the constitutional neutrality of religion. But we do see a lot of opportunistic use of freedom by the creationists and not a principled one. My favorite example was in Florida, where this was, I don't know, less than 10 years ago, where the proponent of an academic freedom bill in Florida was saying, look, we have to give the teachers the freedom to talk about the strengths and weaknesses of evolution. All this is in the same legislative session that she had a bill to ban sex education in the Florida's public schools. And one of her colleagues, asked her about this on the floor. I said, so you trust them to teach biology in any way see fit, but not sex education? And did not receive an answer to that.
Okay, thank you very much.
Right, next one is Isabella. Isabella Fonseca, are you there?
Yes, hello. Hi, Mr. Branch. First, I would like to thank you for your excellent presentation. I'd like to maybe get a little bit away from your research focus on teaching evolution at primary school and bring the discussion to the academy. Specifically, I would like to ask you, what do you think about scientists such as biologists who advocate for creationism? I myself, I live with an excellent postdoctoral researcher. She is graduated in biology here at USP. She publishes in renowned journals, and she believes in intelligent design. And it is very difficult for me and for my laboratory colleagues who live with this researcher to understand how someone manages to do science and reconcile scientific thinking with something like modern creationism. Is it a training error, or does this person not understand what science is despite being an amazing scientist? Or maybe is it something other than scientific knowledge, and academic training and research excellence? And finally, is there anything that can be done in undergraduate courses in biology and other areas of knowledge to overcome the situation?
Yeah, that sounds like an interesting predicament you're in. So the problem here is it's probably not a deficit. I mean, someone with a PhD who's actively engaged in scientific research presumably knows what scientific research is supposed to look like and what valid scientific considerations are. So it's not that she's ignorant, it's that her values are kind of swamping her knowledge. So her acceptance of creationism in the form of intelligent design presumably reflects her faith, something very important to her, and an expectation that the considerations she finds decisive in convincing her that, as it may be, that God exists and cares about her and wants the best for all of us, that this has to be accessible to everybody else, that it must be public, and that there must be a way to bring other people to see it. So, I mean, there are plenty of people who, share that faith, but don't, and even evangelize for it, but don't expect it to be necessarily rationally compelling to all inquirers. So I think it's very difficult to get someone to shift away from that position by presenting them with facts, or by authority. Rather, it's, I think, showing that there are people who as I suggested in the talk, who share her faith in as much granularity as you can, ideally someone of the same denomination, who understands the science, because why should she respect someone who doesn't understand the science but accepts it, and yet doesn't see the science as a threat to the faith. So I don't know what authors there are in Brazil, but as I say, someone like Francis Collins or Ken Miller in the US, qualified scientists who have thought carefully about the issues and regard evolution as compatible with, even enriching their faith, is probably the kinds of influences to expose her to.
Thank you.
Yes, very good point. We have this discussion in class already, and this is something we are always, it's not easy to have a solution, but it's a guideline that the biology teacher has to do with biology, and he or she has not the obligation or even the objective to change the credos, the values, the faith of their students. The point is to teach evolution. Yeah. And we had this discussion also related to the materials in Brazil. I don't know if you are aware of that publication that was done by Alan, I forgot now his surname. It was a publication in US with a few case studies of the teaching of evolution in Brazil. And there were some empirical research showing that it was Allen, the Allen research upon the didactic books, the manuals teachers use here in biology courses in high school mainly, and they were astonished to find that almost every biology textbook begins the chapter, the beginning of the chapter on evolution has the image of any kind of creationism. An image of God, an image of heaven, and then the scientific theory. So this is something that still nowadays there are different points of view in Brazil. You know, Brazil is a very it's a country open for many religions. We say that we are what is the word for I don't know. We accept that we are ecumenic about religion, and in this kind of thinking, many people agree that it's fair to have the creationist explanation in the books or in the classroom, because in this way you can compare and show that one is scientific and the other one is religious. So this position was, I think, the main one, and only in recent years that we have authors of these textbooks, standing for a different position, that no, it's not, we can't put any content on creationism inside the textbook, because this is not science. So this is a shift in the perception of how to deal with the problem that is recent in Brazil. And it is easy when discussing the subject with these students or other students of USP. They are, most of them are already in the classroom teaching biology, even if they are, because many of them are in graduate course and not undergrad. And it's common to hear from them that they prefer to discuss creationism together with evolutionary theory, at least in the beginning of the course. And so I'm just presenting you this situation. And I would like to hear your opinion on that.
Well, that's interesting, and I'd like to look at that study. So there's not necessarily a one-size-fits-all approach for a biology teacher in the United States, at any rate, to take to discussing creationism, whether to raise it in the first place, and what to say about it, and how to respond to student questions. Some teachers just prefer not to have it in the classroom at all. They won't bring it up, and if they a student asks about creationism, they'll say, this is a science class, you talk to your parents or your church or whatever. And then it obviously less extreme versions of that. There are teachers who will have private conversations as needed. And some teachers will take it head on with the intention of, wanting to get it out of the way. So either saying, some of you may have other beliefs about this, but we're not going to be talking about it because of science class. The kind of two things I recommend against sort of across the board are presenting creationism as scientifically credible, because, in a science classroom, you want to not misrepresent the status of claims. So, and attacking students' religious beliefs or seeming to, because that's not helpful for the learning process. And also, given the decentralization of American education, it's a really bad idea for the teacher to do that, because it can cause problems. A parent can come in and complain, and teachers can get disciplined or perhaps even fired over doing that, whether they're attacking a student's religious beliefs, which is clearly a no-no, or merely seeming to, because pre-adult students, are not great on nuance and may not realize they're not being attacked and take it as an attack. So we have not really seen a lot of evidence-based research on which of these strategies is best. There has been a little at the college level where it's easier to do it. And there was one study where, in addition to presenting evolution, an experimental section of the class read and worked on a refutation of some creationist material, and the control group did, I don't know, extra genetics or something. And the experimental section apparently reported more interest and better comprehension. But that's just one study. So we haven't really seen a lot of research on this. So I'm kind of hesitant to recommend anything in particular. Experienced teachers, I think, will have a better idea of what their community is like and what the religious mores are, and have some ideas about how to respond appropriately.
Sure. Thanks. The experience counts a lot.
Yeah.
Thanks.
João, you're the next.
So I would like to ask you one more question, Mr. Branch. I was wondering, based on your research, why do you think that places like the US and Brazil are facing such a bigger problem with creationism in comparison to other areas of the world, like Europe, for example? Is the greater proportion of irreligious people in Europe the only reason for that, or do you think that there's something else?
Well, I think throughout Europe, state churches do a lot to kind of keep religious beliefs more uniform and less extreme. So, so there's that. So, as I said during the talk, in the United States, I think it's this do-it-yourself approach to religion that has kind of been the dominant theme of American religion since before the founding. I'm not as familiar with Brazil, but I think part of it is export of American religious ideas and attitudes. I know that Pentecostalism has been growing by leaps and bounds in Brazil, and a lot of the anti-evolution activity seems to be coming from American religious groups or Brazilian religious groups with ties to American religious groups, including Pentecostalist groups, Seventh-day Adventism. A large chunk of young Earth creationism originates with a Seventh-day Adventist self-taught geologist in the 1920s, a fellow named George McCready Price. And mainline young Earth creationism that you get from Answers in Genesis and the Institute for Creation Research takes on a lot of those ideas, but files off the serial numbers because they don't like Seventh-day Adventists. So I think, my grasp on Brazil's religious history is not great, but I think as Catholicism has stopped being the dominant religion, it's these kind of American-influenced religious traditions that have been burgeoning and kind of bringing in some American-style creationism with them. And this is also true of the nations of the former Soviet Union, actually, where the collapse of the Soviet Union seemed to open a mission field for evangelical creationists, and they brought a lot of creationism into Eastern Europe with them. So I think that's true of at least some of South America as well.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So the next one is Gabriel Vasto. Gabriel?
And then, oh, sorry. And then we are going to finishing. Okay, Marcelo?
Okay.
Hi, Mr. Brandt. Thank you very much for the excellent lecture. Unfortunately, I had to leave to help my mom with my little bro, so I couldn't watch the whole thing. So I don't know if you already talked about it, but what I want to know is what do you think about Dawkins, for example, who writes about evolution and in the same book writes violently against religion, against God. So in my opinion, it's very bad because it creates a sensation even greater that evolution is against religion and against God. So I want to know what you think about it, and thank you very much.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I kind of share your opinion. Dawkins is a marvelous science writer. There are very few science writers I like to read as much as Dawkins. And I think for most of his books, he does kind of distinguish between expounding the science and talking about his atheism. The Blind Watchmaker maybe goes over the line a bit, but his main works expounding atheism, such as the God Delusion, are not intended to be works of science. So yeah, I think it's regrettable, but on the other hand, it's certainly up to Dawkins to decide how he wants to spend his time and what kind of message he wants to send. And so I don't criticize him for doing so. I just kind of regret it a little bit.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. So it's almost 2 o'clock, or for you it's 10 o'clock?
Getting there.
Yeah, so 2 hours already. We are very pleased to have you, Glenn Branch, and I'm looking forward to have more time and an entire course with you and our students in the near future. So Thank you. Thanks a lot, and we will keep in touch.
Okay, thanks very much for having me. Thanks for all the great questions and the kind words.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.